The summer of 1900. In Indianapolis, a city health officer named John Hurty watched a thing he could not stop. All across his city, infants were dying, and at the orphanage that summer, the newspapers counted the dead and laid the blame on the milk, on a chemical poured into it to keep it from souring on a warm shelf. Across the city, the toll ran into the hundreds. The chemical was formaldehyde, the same fluid that embalmed the dead, and it had been sold to honest dairymen under a cheerful brand name. This is the story of how it came to be in a baby's bottle, and of the long, stubborn fight to get it out. For nearly the whole of human history, a family ate what it grew, raised, or put up with its own two hands, and it knew that food the way it knew its own kin. But across the long decades after the Civil War, through the 1870s, the 1880s, and the slow turn into a new century, the kitchen began to move out of the home and into the factory. Your bread came from a bakery clear across town, your milk from a dairy you would never lay eyes on, your beef from a packing house 1,000 miles off in Chicago. And along that 1,000-mile road, a great deal could be done to your supper that you would never see and were never told. We like to tell ourselves the old pantry was a safe place, and in the farmhouse it truly was. The mason jars catching the light on a cellar shelf, the butter wrapped in cloth, the crock of pickles, the smokehouse ham. Honest food put up by honest hands and known down to the last jar. But that pantry had a twin, and the twin lived down at the grocery store, where the jar on the shelf looked just the same, and the label never told you the difference. So today we are counting down 25 things the factories of that age hid in American food, some of them merely dishonest, some of them genuinely poisonous, and a few that took a child's life before any chemist could prove what was in the bottle. We will count them down from 25 to 1. Let us begin where the trouble began. Number 25. We start in the city dairy, and we start with milk, because milk was the most tampered with food in America. In the crowded districts of New York and Brooklyn, dairies were built right beside the whiskey distilleries, and the cows were fed on the hot, sour mash left over from making liquor. The milk that came out was thin, bluish, and faintly sour, so it was fixed, whitened, thickened, sweetened, long before it ever reached a doorstep. They called it swill milk, and for the better part of the century, it was simply what city children drank for breakfast. And before we go any further, if a story like that one is the kind of history you came for, the honest texture of how people truly lived, then you are among friends here. Subscribe and ring the bell, and we will keep carrying these forgotten things back to the table, one at a time. There is a seat saved for you. Now, back to the cupboard. Number 24. Sugar was money, and money invites cheating. Refiners and confectioners learned to stretch a barrel of sugar with terra alba, a fine white powder of ground gypsum, and when they were lazy about it, plain sand. It added weight on the scale and bulk in the bag, and to the eye it vanished completely into the white. You paid for sugar and carried home a measure of plaster and grit. The penny candy on the counter got the same treatment, chalk and gypsum bulking out the sweets meant for children. Number 23. A jar of honey and a jug of maple syrup were premium goods, the patient work of bees and sugar maples. So the factory found a shortcut. Cheap corn glucose, thin and nearly flavorless, was poured into honey to stretch it, then tinted and flavored to pass as maple. A homesteader knew her own honey by its comb and its color. A shopper in town had only the label to go on, and the label said pure when the jar said otherwise. Number 22. Lard was the fat that fried the eggs and shortened the pie crust in nearly every American kitchen. The packers learned to stretch it with cheap cottonseed oil, Then firm it back up and whiten it with a little alum and soda so the tub looked like the real rendered article. It cost them less and sold for the same. The cook at the stove could not see the difference until the crust behaved strangely, and even then she had no way to know why. Number 21. Tea traveled a long way to reach an American cup, and dishonest dealers made it travel even further from the truth. Spent tea leaves, already brewed once, dried out, and sold again as new, were brushed back to a healthy green with Prussian blue, indigo, and turmeric. The cheapest grades were barely tea at all, a swept-up mixture of leaves, dust, and dye pressed into shape. The color in the canister was a costume. What it hid, the label never told you. And keep watching, because a little further down this list, at number 8, the cheating turns truly cruel, for that one was aimed straight at children. Number 20. Ground coffee was the easiest thing in the world to fake, because once it was a brown powder, who could possibly tell? Roasted chicory, peas, beans, acorns, date pits, even ground biscuit went into the tin and out the door as coffee. When Dr. Harvey Wiley's chemists at the Department of Agriculture began testing what Americans were actually buying, they turned up samples of coffee that contained no coffee at all, not a single bean. You bought the smell of the word and brewed a cup of roasted filler. Number 19. White bread was a mark of quality, and white flour cost dear. So bakers reached for alum, a cheap astringent borrowed from the dye and tanning trades, to whiten a coarser, grayer flour and to pass off old, spoiled grain as fresh. It made the loaf white, heavy, and profitable. It also made it hard to digest, and for the poor families who lived on bread, the cramps and the misery were a daily tax they could not even name. Number 18. An alum had company in the flour barrel. To add weight, because flour was sold by the pound, millers and middlemen mixed in plaster of Paris, ground gypsum, powdered chalk, even ground stone and bone. White on white, it disappeared. The housewife sifted it, kneaded it, baked it, and fed it to her family, never once suspecting that a fair share of her loaf was, quite literally, the wall of the room ground into powder. Number 17. When cheap oleomargarine arrived, it threatened the dairy farmer, so the factories dyed it a rich butter yellow and sold it as the real article at a butter price. The fight over that yellow grew so fierce that some states passed laws forcing margarine to be sold dead white, or even dyed pink, so no one could be fooled. And the butter itself was not always innocent. To keep it sweet on a long shelf, dealers dosed it with borax, which begins to carry us toward the chemicals. Number 16. Back to the milk, because the dairymen were not finished. After thinning it with water, they had to rebuild it. Chalk and plaster dust went into it to restore the white. Yellow dye went into the milk to fake the cream line, and in one notorious trick, pureed calf brains were stirred in to imitate a layer of rich cream, because as one health official dryly observed, it really did look like cream until it curdled in the hot coffee. And keep watching for number 6, the scandal that gave this whole era its name. Number 15. Now we cross from cheating into chemistry. Saltpeter, potassium nitrate, had a long and honest history in the curing of meat, but the factory found newer uses for it. And when Dr. Wiley sat his famous volunteers down to test the preservatives of the day, saltpeter went into their fruit pies right alongside the copper. It was one of a dozen chemicals quietly doing work in food that no eater had agreed to and no label announced. Number 14. Sulfites, sulfurous acid and its salts could do something close to magic, and that was exactly the problem. A wash of sulfite could take meat that had begun to turn and brighten it back to a fresh, wholesome red. It could keep dried apricots and apples glowing and soft. It hid age and decay behind a healthy color. When Wiley's poison squad tested it, the men grew sick enough that the trial had to be stopped halfway through, and still it stayed in the food supply for years. Number 13. Here is our first surprise, because not every story on this list ends in a ban. Saccharin, the coal tar sweetener, landed squarely on Wiley's roster of suspect additives. But when he pressed the case, he ran straight into President Theodore Roosevelt, who used saccharin himself on his doctor's orders, and reportedly snapped that anyone who called it dangerous was an idiot. Saccharin survived. Sometimes the science lost to the man at the head of the table, and the additive Wiley distrusted stayed right where it was. Number 12. And here is the second surprise. Sodium benzoate was among the additives Wiley fought hardest against. His report on it was so damning that his own superiors tried to bury it. But the food industry pushed back hard. A board of scientific referees was convened, and it overruled him. Benzoate was declared safe in small amounts and allowed to remain. The crusading chemist did not win every battle. Some of the chemicals he put on trial walked free, and benzoate is in food to this day. Number 11. Salicylic acid was the quiet one, a preservative dropped into canned goods, wine, and condiments to hold off spoilage, working in the background where nobody thought to look. It sat on Wiley's testing table beside the borax and the formaldehyde. It never made the headlines the deadlier chemicals did, but it was one more thing standing between an eater and the truth of what was in the can. After the reckoning, it slipped quietly out of the food supply. We are coming now to the worst of them. By the time we reach number 3, you will meet the embalming fluid that was sold behind a cheerful brand name for a baby's milk. Number 10. Have you ever wondered why canned peas and pickles once glowed such a cheerful, unnatural green? That was copper sulfate bluestone added to fool the eye. Real cooked peas are a drab olive. A dose of copper made them bright and appetizing on the shelf. It was beauty, bottled, with a metal salt doing the lying. When the poison squad worked through Wiley's list, copper sulfate was on it, and after the testing, it largely vanished from the canning line. Number 9. Lead chromate was a pigment, a brilliant and poisonous yellow, and it found its way into food in 2 clever, terrible ways. It brightened cheap mustard into a rich golden paste, and stirred into thin, skimmed, bluish milk. It faked the warm cream color of the whole article. Lead was fed by the spoonful to families who believed they were buying nothing but mustard and milk. The brighter the color, the bolder the lie. Number 8. Now the cruelest one, because it was aimed at children. The candy in the shop window was colored with whatever was cheap and bright, and what was cheap and bright was often arsenic green and lead chromate yellow. When the chemist Jesse Battershall tested 198 samples of American candy, he found 115 of them tainted with dangerous dyes. Of 48 yellow and orange candies, 41 carried lead. A penny's worth of sweets, paid for with a dose of poison. Number 7. Borax was the workhorse of the preservative trade. It slowed rot, and in meat it did something especially sinister. It reacted with the proteins and firmed spoiling flesh back into a shapely, saleable cut. It went into butter to keep it fresh, into meat to keep it moving. It was so common and so suspected that when Wiley chose the very first chemical for his volunteers to eat, he chose borax. The headaches and the stomach pains they suffered put the whole embalmed food question on the national table. Number 6. Then came the scandal that gave the whole era its name. During the Spanish-American War, the Army fed its soldiers canned and refrigerated beef from the big Chicago packers, and much of it arrived rotten. Officers testified that the canned beef had been packed with a visible layer of boric acid to mask the stench of decay. General Nelson Miles called it embalmed beef, and the name stuck fast. Theodore Roosevelt, who served in Cuba, said he would sooner have eaten his old hat. Soldiers sickened. Some died. The country was listening now. Number 5. The embalmed beef hearings threw open a window onto the can itself, and what people saw inside was in some ways worse than the chemicals. The canned meat sold to the army was described as little more than a bundle of stringy fibers, the scraps and leavings pressed together, chemically treated, and sealed up beneath a wholesome label. Upton Sinclair would soon take readers inside those packing houses in the jungle, and a nation that had trusted the tin would never quite trust it the same way again. Number 4. Even the ketchup bottle kept a secret. To keep cheap, hastily made ketchup from spoiling, manufacturers loaded it with sodium benzoate, and to give it that appetizing red, they reached for coal tar dye. It was preserved and painted at once, but this story has a hero. H.J. Heinz wagered that Americans would pay for honesty. He built a ketchup from ripe tomatoes and good vinegar that needed no benzoate at all, then printed that fact proudly on the label. For once, the label told you the truth, and the truth sold. Number 3. Now the worst of them. Formaldehyde, the embalming fluid of the funeral parlor, was poured into milk to stop it souring, and its faint sweetness even improved the taste of milk gone thin and old. The chemical companies gave it innocent names. Iceline and Preservaline were sold to dairymen with the promise of keeping a pint fresh for 10 days. It was embalming fluid in a baby's bottle, behind a Cheerful brand name. Of every chemical on Wiley's table, formaldehyde would prove the one most clearly and completely outlawed. Number 2, and this is why it mattered, told as plainly as it can be. In Indianapolis, the state's health officer, John Hurty, watched milk laced with formaldehyde move through his city. Indiana had passed a pure food law in 1899, but with no money to enforce it, dairymen only pushed the dose higher to keep the milk fresh longer. In the summer of 1900, the newspaper reported the deaths of infants at the city orphanage from formaldehyde poisoning. Across the city, the toll was counted in the hundreds. These were the deaths that turned outrage into law. Behind every additive on this list was a label that never told you, and behind that silence were children who paid the price. Number 1 is none of those. We are nearly to number 1 now. Everything we have counted has been a poison, a cheat, or a lie. Number 1, it was not a poison, it was not a dye, or a powder, or a cheat. It was the end of them. Harvey Wiley had spent years building the case, the poison squad, the reports, the testimony, the slow public reckoning. 1 million American women wrote to the White House. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle turned stomachs from coast to coast. And on the 30th of June, 1906, President Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act. For the first time, it was a federal crime to sell adulterated or mislabeled food across state lines. The factory could still make your food, but at last, by law, the label had to tell you the truth. Number 17, meatloaf with tomato glaze and green beans. It is easy, looking back, to feel only the horror of it. But there is another way to see this story. For most of American history, the safest food was the food a family put up themselves. The cellar jar, the smokehouse, the churn, precisely because they knew exactly what went into it. When the factory came, it offered convenience, and too often it hid the cost behind a pretty label. The pure food fight was, in its way, the country insisting on the very same honesty the old homestead pantry had always taken for granted. The crafts we have lost were not merely quaint, they were trustworthy, and that is worth remembering the next time you read a label. So here is the small thing I will leave you with. The next time you are at the store, turn the jar around and read the back of the label, the whole list of what is inside. It is a plain little habit, and it cost you nothing. But 100 years ago, it was impossible, and people died for the lack of it. That simple right to know what is in your own food is the whole quiet victory these stubborn, forgotten people won for you. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these 25 surprised you the most? Or did your own family pass down a way of telling the real thing from the fake? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. If this brought a forgotten piece of American life back to you, subscribe and ring the bell so the next story finds you. And next time we are taking down a quilt from the back of the closet, the kind a great-grandmother might have stitched by lamplight, and sitting with one of the most beloved stories in all of American craft. That certain patterns hung out on a fence or a clothesline carried secret messages for people slipping north toward freedom. It is a story almost everyone has heard. What we are going to ask, gently and honestly, is how much of it the quilts can really bear out. I will see you there.